So today I'm going to talk about controlling product risk through testing and why I don't believe that the point of sale testing scheme that most states are employing right now is enough. A little bit of background about me. I actually created some of the first Oregon laboratory legislation with the first pesticide lists and the first solvent lists. And we were charged with creating a point of sale testing scheme. And by the time I left, after having talked to people in the food industry and the pharmaceutical industries and in the agricultural industries, actually, what I realized is you can't control everything at a point of sale. You really have to control your own risk as a processor or a producer or a cultivator. It did go. Okay. So in the current state of the industry, we all know what a mess it was a couple of years ago, but it's really starting to come together. There's still a lot of risk. You have a lot of risk in your business and in your product. We have supply chain risk. Do you know what you're getting? Do you know where it came from? Do you know if it's contaminated, adulterated? Is it going to be the same every time? You have brand risk. A lot of people are just coming into their branding schemes, and when they are not considering their product changing from time to time, their brand is at risk of kind of being diluted. Contamination risk, we're all well familiar with the pesticide issues and the metals issues out there right now. Loss of product, missed dosage, recall, and the one we're all really scared of is the public health events. So let's examine the point of sale testing scheme. How many people here test with compliance labs currently? In what states? California, Oregon? Anybody else? And so let's look at these first questions. So have we captured all the risks with the pesticide list, with the solvent list? Some states are testing for metals. We're only testing the final product. Not really. Those lists kind of create a de facto approved list for everything that's not on there, and people are just moving to different types of pesticides. In my last panel, we were just talking about the new move towards fogging with sulfur as a pest control technique and how all that sulfur is ending up in the extracts. It doesn't allow for comprehensive oversight and enforcement because these very limited lists are not addressing every type of product that we are making. You're going to have very different risks if you're making a suppository than if you're making a topical, right? So a single list for all of the products is never going to capture all the different type of contaminants you could have. And it's also never going to give you enough information to control your product. And product control is very important to moving forward in this industry. So we kind of went through the cons. So we're in the part of the industry now where we really need to differentiate ourselves. Clinical trials, sorry, I can't really read my own slide right here. Have started, but there's a lot of snake oil out there, and how do you compete when there's things on the shelves of Walgreens that don't even have CBD in them, but they're claiming they're CBD? We have people claiming that CBD can cure everything. I mean, I have seen it in so many different products for so many different conditions, and we know that can't be true. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And then we have the medical market who are really starting to demand specific products. Even with people with seizures, they are finding that different strains of CBD don't work as well as other strains, and how do they get the same CBD extract, CBD medicine every time to control their conditions? So FDA oversight is already in place for CBD. They might not be enforcing it yet, but anyone who is producing CBD consumable products right now should be GMP compliant. And when that hammer comes down, and hopefully it won't be because of a public health event, it's going to be a big one. It's going to be hard to come up fast. GMP is not something that you just jump right into. There's a lot of planning that goes into it, and there's a lot of staff resources that you're going to need. So it's good to prepare now. And the FDA doesn't use a point-of-sale testing scheme for all the reasons we just discussed. They want the companies to control their own risk. And the reason I think it works, whereas the states didn't believe they could do this with cannabis initially, is that there's major consequences in the FDA world. If something gets pulled off the shelf and it's got contaminants, or something causes a public health event, people are going to jail. They're not just losing one batch of product. you're going to jail, you're getting fined. I mean, you're losing licenses. The consequences mean that people in the food industry, more so the pharmaceutical industry, they are doing enough testing to avoid those kinds of consequences, where we are just looking at product loss. Now, I know it's a huge amount of money, product loss, but it didn't seem enough to the states to be driving, letting the producers control their own risk. And so we as an industry really need to come up independently and start to drive this so that the regulators can back off, because they're kind of going in the wrong direction. And I'm saying that as a former regulator. HACCP is what's used in a lot of food industries, and hazard analysis and critical control points. You do an evaluation, beginning of your process, your source material, all the way through to your final product and your packaging, and you look at different places where contaminants could be entering. So you have human microbial risk, and you're looking at one-way flows of personnel. You can look at things going from like the intermediate step of extraction into the winterization process. You know, like how are you transferring those products? There's all kinds of different places in different processes that you might be at risk where someone else might not be. So you really want to start off doing a HACCP evaluation, if you can, of your process. So just some of the basics of controlling risk. You have to have procedures, you have to have them written down. Everybody needs to be able to go to the same place and read the same procedure for the same process so that it's consistent all the time. You need to be able to go back 5 years later or in a month if there is a health event or a customer complaint or a recall. You need to be able to go back and say, this is how we produced this product. We could repeat it. Traceability is a big one. I spoke on a panel about product risk with some lawyers about a year ago, and they are assuming that right now, if there was a public health event, basically without proper traceability, every single part of that supply chain would be liable. So if you have your own traceability, you have your own validated lab data that's admissible in court, you might get away with it not being your fault because it's not your fault. But if you don't have these things, you're going to be liable if someone downstream from you produces a product that has a public health event. I feel like this also, and we had this discussion, I feel like it also might apply in California at the distribution centers. So you really got to start to think about where your product is being stored, with what other products, and how much risk are those other products to yours? How much risk is your source material? How much risk is the final product that you're selling your extract to, like an edible product to dose? You are going to be liable for that whole supply chain until the industry kind of shapes up and starts to control some of this risk. And laboratory testing, I mean, this is the point of the whole sort of presentation, is that we're only doing testing at the very end. It gives us zero information. There's all kinds of testing that we really need to start doing all the way through the process in order to control this. And we can do in-house testing. Just because compliance labs have to have a license in order to report to the state doesn't mean you have to use a compliance lab for all of your in-process testing. You can have an in-house lab, and I strongly recommend that you do. But there are also food labs out there, agricultural labs out there that are accepting hemp and cannabis products right now for this type of testing. It's cheaper than compliance testing, and you can ask for your own testing schemes, your own quality control, your own analytes. You're controlling your own risk in this situation. So we really need to kind of step up with the testing and get away from the lists and get towards an evaluation of your process, how much product control you actually have. And then you have to believe that your data is reliable. You have to be working with that lab. If it's not an in-house lab, are you doing data validation? Are you sending split samples to another laboratory? How are you checking that that data, should you ever be involved in a lawsuit, can be admissible in court? Because if it's not admissible, there's nothing to defend. So just as more some of the basics of controlling risk, this is really consistent through ISO, like ISO 17025, ISO 9001, ISO 22000, which is the food safety ISO standard. It's GMP. You need to be doing self-evaluations, internal audits. Clients in other industries regularly audit their vendors. It is just part of the ISO scheme. So be ready for client audits. There is, I mean, definitely IP out there, and there's confidentiality agreements in place. But in legitimate industries, clients are auditing their vendors all the time. You need to be ready for that. And that's where kind of this transparency and traceability becomes really important. We talked about data validation and split samples, and then you want to be doing ongoing monitoring of your process. So if you're testing like your source material and your intermediate product and your final product, how are you validating that when you wipe that counter down with isopropyl alcohol that you're actually killing the organisms on the counter? Are you doing any cleaning validations? Have you ever tested the water that you're using? These are all the kinds of things in a GMP scheme that you really need to start thinking about as far as testing goes. Why would I want to do more testing? And we all know, like right now, the cannabis laboratories, it is kind of a murky world still. And if you can find a lab that, that will work with you on some of these off-list schemes, then you've found a really good lab. If they understand why you want to do this type of testing, they're willing to like design that with you, they're willing to run your QC, that's the lab you want to be working with because they're meeting the client's needs. And if a laboratory can only run those 7 tests that the state requires, you have to kind of like wonder how well they're doing those. They should be able to be validating other methods for their clients. So product control, we just had a panel on product control being absolutely necessary for the future of the medicine. And we had some great experts on there. I highly recommend you speak with them. I think it was the Holy Grail of Cannabis was the title. So you need to evaluate your client needs and future opportunities. Labeling is a big deal right now. What are we going to call CBD in the meantime when we don't know what the FDA is going to do? Certificates of analysis. I haven't actually walked this floor yet, but a year ago I walked a hemp expo floor and asked every CBD producer if they could give me a COA of the products that they were selling, and it was in New York, so they were actually selling them at the conference. 2 of them out of 15 could give me a COA on their CBD product. That's disturbing. So we should definitely be ready to be more accountable to our clients with the very least testing of our final product, at the very least. So, I mean, R&D has to do with scaling. It's a whole presentation all by itself. We did talk a little bit about HACCP, and, how many people here have done a HACCP evaluation on there? Okay, and how much testing do you do as a result of that? Oh, okay. Have you done it in this industry? Didn't somebody raise their hand over here? No, so one person in the room has done a HACCP evaluation. Is anyone employing any type of GMP procedures now or looking into becoming GMP compliant? So people are just starting to come on to this. I'm really happy to see some hands raised a year ago. I don't think anybody was. But let's look at this case study. So the point of sale testing. Oh, I'm sorry. What would be some differences in the monitoring schemes that you would have if you were producing flower versus full spectrum oil versus cannabis infused product? I think I missed that there. What would be the difference in the GMP testing scheme for, let's just say, use my original example, suppository versus topical? More microbials? What else would you test for with a suppository that you wouldn't necessarily be at risk for with the topical, and vice versa? So, I mean, I think they all need to be tested for pesticides, I really do, but, when you consider the suppository is going into somebody's body, so that kind of micro-contamination could be like a really terrible health risk. Alcohols are really interesting because they're not likely to be a risk in a suppository, but I do know someone who is in remission from skin cancer, and the CBD product she was using, one batch of it gave her a solvent burn. And so she had to start testing all of her own products as she was recovering from skin cancer because the product that she was using wasn't consistent from time to time, and she was getting solvent burns. So she found that a lot of the products on the shelves actually had very high solvent concentrations. So topicals really need to consider that. So water testing. I know that Maryland is asking people for water use plans. Massachusetts asks that you test your growth media for Pretty much everything you have to test your product for. Are any other states requiring water testing right now? California is? What are they requiring you test for? Oh, so water activity in your product is actually an indicator of whether or not you can have more microbial growth. So that is actually an indicator versus percent moisture, which California really shouldn't have a limit on because that's just a tool to calculate your dry weight and kind of standardize your results. But water activity is used in food to indicate how much more microbial growth you could have. When I speak to water testing, I'm more speaking of your growth media water if you're doing hydroponics, the water you're using to water your plants, the water you're using for extraction, dilution, formulation. How many people are testing their water right now? Awesome. How many people are using like a DI or a DO or an RO water system? Very cool. So if you're not testing your water and you're not treating your water, or at least deionizing it, you're going to have all kinds of risks that come from just watering your plants or creating your extract. Environmental testing, I feel like this is something we really need to come up on. When people are failing for pesticides, they're not always using pesticides. Maybe someone previously in that building had already fogged and it's in like the sheetrock. Maybe, if you're not doing checks of your environment, if you're not doing checks of your building, then you don't really know what all your sources of contamination could be. We need to do a lot more sterility checks in the processing of these products because we don't know why we're failing at this point of sale. If no one's doing this testing all the way through the process, we don't have data to make new decisions, and we don't know why or how to improve our process. So legacy contaminants are also a very big deal. There are pesticides that have been outlawed since 1972 showing up in some cultivator soil samples. So they stick around for a long, long time. So we talked a little bit about in-process product testing. I think one of the things that people are missing the most is the reagents, the different things you're using that aren't your active ingredient but still need to be pure. Try to do testing of everything that is touching your product. Shelf life studies. How many people have done a shelf life study? I love you guys in the back. I don't know where you're from, but so we're talking about products that are losing their smell or they're starting to smell bitter, they're starting to taste bitter or taste poor. Terpenes are going rancid. We have lipids, we have alkaloids. And in the end, how are we storing it? How's the distributor storing it? How's the dispensary storing it? Do you need to refrigerate your product? What conditions are ideal? And how are you going to actually assign that expiration date that everyone's putting on their labels? Right now, I see a lot of people just kind of using a year or 2 years. We need to start looking at our product and seeing how it breaks down. Not to mention losing potency, but we all use glass jars and like amber glass jars and keep it out of the dark. And there's even newer methods now to control humidity and everything else. But then we put the products out to the public and we don't have any sort of data on how the dispensary should even have it on the shelf. So product control studies, these are really important. If you can't control your product, again, you're having a lot of brand risk, but you can't make medicine. There can't be clinical trials. And flavor and formulation chemists are in high demand right now in this market. It is so difficult to control products when you're having different biomass sources all the time, but it can be done. And there are experts in the industry that can talk to you more about how to do that. I'm blanking on the names of the people in my former panel, but they were all some of the experts that you really would like to talk to as far as your product control. Because if you can't control your product, you can't control your risk. Non-conforming product testing. So if you have a customer complaint or a competitor pulls you off the shelf or you do want to check your lab, non-conforming product is a GMP or an ISO 9001 concept. You're supposed to be pulling that production. You're supposed to be quarantining it. You're supposed to be addressing why it didn't conform. Now, if you're not monitoring your product and you don't have specifications and you don't have control limits, you don't know why it's not conforming, and all you really have is that customer complaint and or the lawsuit. So non-conforming product testing is something where you're monitoring and you find out that product is non-conforming, and then that's what we're not doing right now. So where to begin? Quality by design is a pharmaceutical GMP concept. It talks about beginning from the beginning. Before you buy your facility, before you build your facility out, think about the flooring, think about the HVAC, think about all the different things you need to control one-way flows. Like if your building is 2 stories and you have like the shipping and receiving area right next to your packaging area, like what kind of risk is that, and who's going back and forth between this untested source material and your final product as it's getting packaged? So you need to do risk assessments that have to do with, again, your process, because your process will be unique, and these one-size-fits-all schemes just don't work. So you need to have an implementation strategy. A gap audit is definitely a way you can have that strategy. You want to have someone come in who is an expert in these areas and tell you where your biggest points of risk are. It would be great if we could all employ quality by design right now and start from the beginning again, but most of us are already in operation. And so instead of being able to start from the beginning, you really want to find out what your biggest risks are, and you want to start testing and monitoring there. Do you need your own lab? I mean, there's a lot of pros and cons to having your own lab. If you can afford it, you can do most of your own GMP and process testing. I highly recommend it. It's also another revenue stream for you because there are going to be processors and producers that can afford to have their own lab, and you don't need to be licensed as a compliance lab to do this kind of process testing. So consider that as a revenue stream as you control your own risk. So that was it. I was trying to fit the 30 minutes in. Does anybody have any questions?
Hang on one second. Let me get this over there to you.
Can you recommend a strategy or talk to the fact that we have some of these manufacturing and processing facilities in different states where we're making distillate, we're making infused food and beverages, and we have our own lab? So we're looking at 17025 accreditation, we're
Right.
looking at 9001 accreditation, we're looking at the difference between the Food Modernization Act and the hazard analysis risk-based assessment
Right.
critical control points versus the hazard analysis critical control points. What's the strategy to kind of make a hybrid?
Yeah.
Or do you go out and get all those accreditations?
I just spoke on this actually at Analytical Cannabis. You want to create what we call an integrated quality management system. Like ISO 17025, 22000, HACCP, GMP, they have a lot of very common tenants. So they're all going to have requirements for testing procedures. They're all going to have requirements for training procedures. I mean, they all kind of encapture this administrative part of the quality management system, and then you want to bring in all of the technical pieces from each one. So maybe you need to do both types of evaluations, or maybe you can kind of determine what's covering what. So you said HACCP and risk-based and...
Well, the Food Safety Modernization Act, they used the hazard analysis risk-based preventative controls now,
Right.
versus the hazard analysis critical control points. The language has changed.
in FSMA, right?
Yeah, in FSMA, correct.
Yeah, so that's just like starting to implement really heavily in the United States, and I think that you're right. I'm like a little outdated with like the HACCP, and we're moving in that direction. I would definitely go with the most recent guidance.
Okay, so bottom line is kind of be prepared for all and,
Yeah,
and
you
be able to pivot quickly.
I would say if you're building any kind of quality management system to be compliant with state regulation, with FDA, for your clients, and you're getting ISO, it is so much more cost effective for you to completely do all of your requirements. So if you need to have 17025, 22000, 9001 GMP, and maybe EU, like European GMP, or you want to sell in Australia, if you're putting that system together piecemeal, it's not going to work very well. You're going to have a lot of findings in all of the different standards. If you build it together from the beginning, it's going to work a lot better. The traceability, unique numbering systems, evaluating vendors, all of those things, if you do it consistently, will make all the auditors happy, speaking as an auditor. But
And even without a lab, I mean, all your process equipment should be validated per
Yeah.
17025 anyways.
they should. I think that if you have a process testing lab, you should definitely be moving towards 17025. If you don't need it and your clients don't need you to have it, again, there's other quality control and self-evaluations that you can do, such as sending split samples out. And what we really need is a primacy or reference lab, the way drinking water or like food has, where they are the final say and the standard in the industry. But right now, there's really no driver for that. There's no profit driver because they're usually have to be not in conflict. So as an industry, we really need to start to demand that nationally we have a primacy lab that's looking into some of this. Anyone else?
You said something about the shelf life. How do you test for shelf life? Every product has like a different life expectancy. Like the flour, the THC starts to convert to CBN.
Right.
With tinctures, the oils may start to go rancid.
Yep.
How do you do that kind of test? I'm just curious.
Right, and first you have to decide, and you made a very good point, the THC is breaking down all the time. You have to decide what is your shelf life? Is it when the potency it starts to degrade, or is it when, things are starting to go rancid? You have to understand your product in order to know what to test for. But then you set up a study, a shelf life study, where you have different storage conditions for different amounts of time, and you have testing at like each one of those points. So, in a freezer, in a refrigerator, controlled temperatures, and then like all the way through 6 months to a year, you want to like look at the degradation and see if you can get it linear. It would be really great, but it's normally not linear. There's normally a point where everything just kind of falls off the cliff. So you want to continue to test in those conditions until you fall off that cliff, and then back it way up.
Probably a good idea to test it after a year to see where it is and where it was, just to do your own little studies on
Exactly.
the back page and then report it to.
Yep. If you have access to any of your products you produced a year ago, you can start collecting that data now. You don't have to set up the
Not a
study.
bad idea. Thanks.
Yep. Anyone else?
Still got some time, yep.
Yeah.
Do you know of anyone that's done oxidation properties on the CBD oil and what that looks like?
I know that. I do. Let me get back to you on that. I would be concerned I'd be violating some kind of NDA, so let me double check my notes.
And what kind of methodology would you be using? There's 3 or 4 different antioxidant tests, but all of them have different ways to read them. Do you have a preferred method?
I don't. I have an environmental background, so like GMP and me have been together for about 3 years. But just because I see the value in it so strongly, I would have to go back to one of my experts in that area.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shannon.